Welcome back to GLB Productions. Bruno Luce here. Thanks for joining me. In March of 2015, I published a video entitled Stompbox/Pedal DIs featuring the Tech 21 Sansamp Bass Driver DI as well as the Boss 83. In that video, I said about the Sansamp that, quote, it essentially allows you to sound like you're playing through an Ampeg SVT. Now, it's important to note that those were my words, not Tech 21's. The company has never, to my knowledge, claimed that their products represent or reproduce a specific amplifier model. The user manual for the current Bass Driver DI states that the unit, quote, dials up big vintage tube tones, bright modern slap sounds, gnarly distortions, and all in between. In addition, they refer to the drive control as the pedal as controlling the, quote, tube amplifier emulation circuitry, again making no reference to specific makes or models. However, in the last few years, we have started to see the release of what are generally referred to as amplifier emulation pedals. These are analog or digital recreations of specific historical amplifier models complete with all the original controls. These pedals also feature the historically correct loudspeaker emulation, which allows them to function as complete amplifier replacements. In other words, you plug your guitar into the pedal into the PA system, and the result supposedly sounds exactly as though you are playing through a real, mic'd up vintage amplifier. Two of the companies at the forefront of this type of development are Universal Audio and Origin Effects. Universal Audio refer to their pedals as amplifier emulators, and as of the making of this video, they have three of these. The Dream 65, which is an emulation of a 1965 Fender Twin Reverb, the Ruby 63, which is an emulation of a 1963 Vox AC30, and the Woodrow 55, which is an emulation of a 1955 Fender Tweed Deluxe. Once again though, Universal Audio do not use the word Fender or Vox in any of their marketing material, preferring instead to refer to the source amplifier as American or British, standard practice in the music industry for decades now. The difference with these new units though is that the amplifier and loudspeaker emulation is so good that many independent reviewers state that they often forget that they are playing through a pedal. So, why is this important for us sound engineers? One word: simplicity. Having a pedal that can completely replace a vintage amplifier simplifies both our logistics arrangements and signal chains. Vintage tube amplifiers are large and often extraordinarily heavy for their size. For example, the Ampeg SVT Classic, still in production today, weighs over 36 kilos or 80 pounds for the head alone. The massive refrigerator-sized 8x10 cabinet weighs over 63 kilos or 140 pounds, not including any sort of flight case. If this combination can effectively be replaced by a pedal, that's a weight saving of 100 kilograms or 220 pounds, which represents a very substantial cost savings when it comes to transportation, especially air freight. In terms of signal chain, all of these pedals come equipped with balanced outputs which allow direct connection to your mixing console. No more miking up amplifiers on stage, no more mics moving around or being knocked out of position during the performance, and no more having to deal with a snare drum in your bass guitar channel. With more and more stages going ampless, especially for corporate, theatrical, and house of worship type events, this type of pedal can be a godsend for both musicians and sound engineers. For musicians, it allows them to experience the full effect of a mic'd up vintage tube amplifier through the sound system without the back-breaking task of transporting one and the often wallet-breaking task of maintaining one. As a bass player myself, I can attest to the fact that, given an effective and well-adjusted stage monitor system, there is almost no loss of feel or tonal experience between playing through this versus a real amplifier. Something I would never have said even 5 years ago. Having said that, the fact that the player is completely reliant on the monitor system to hear him or herself does put additional responsibility onto you, the sound engineer. I think that there are two key questions that sound engineers need to answer when dealing with this latest generation of amp emulation pedals. First of all, how do we connect this type of pedal preamp DI to our sound systems? Secondly, what do we need to know about the operation of these units in order to work effectively with the musicians who are using them? In order to answer these questions, we're going to look at a good example of the type in the form of the Origin Effects Bassrig 64 black panel. The Origin Effects Bassrig 64 black panel is one of two bass amplifier emulation pedals in Origin's lineup, the other one being the Bassrig Super Vintage. Unlike the pedals from Universal Audio, which use digital emulation, these pedals are fully analog. In the words of Origin, the pedal uses, quote, all analog circuitry to recreate a complete valve amplifier signal path along with an all-analog cabinet simulator. So it's vital to understand that this is not just a tube emulation / overdrive pedal like the Sansamp. This replicates in miniature, using discrete transistor-based circuitry, the entire signal path of a mid-1960s Fender Bassman or Fender Showman. This includes a push-pull output section with a reactive load that simulates the interaction between the amplifier and the loudspeaker, as well as an analog simulation of the historically correct Fender 2x15 speaker cabinet. Origin is very upfront about this in both their promotional material as well as their owner's manual. Please note, I don't work for Origin, and this video is not sponsored by them. I'm very grateful to my friend and fellow musician Hugh, the owner of this quite expensive pedal, who has loaned it to the channel in order to make this video possible. Also, this video is not meant to be a full review of this pedal. There are plenty of those already available on YouTube. Rather, it's meant to be a discussion of how to approach this type of amp emulated DI as a live sound engineer. The signal chain for this entire video is my 2013 American Standard Precision bass into the 64 black panel and then into a Tascam DR100 Mark III recorder. The bass is strung with flat wounds to give a more typical early to mid-60s bass tone. To begin with, let's address the question, how do we connect this type of pedal preamp DI to our sound systems? On the top or front of the panel, you have 4 connectors. A 9-volt DC in connector, a 1/4-inch instrument socket where the bass would be plugged in, a 1/4-inch amp out socket, and a balanced XLR output. You'll notice that these are very similar to the connections found on your standard DI box, such as this Radial J48. You have 1/4-inch input and through connectors on one end and a balanced XLR output on the other. Now, traditionally, you would connect the bass guitar to the DI box and then connect the XLR output to the mixing console, with the through connection going to the input of the bass amp. You can still do this with the Bassrig using the amp out connector. However, I believe that the most effective way to use this pedal is as an amplifier replacement. Instead of hearing himself via an amplifier, the bass sound is sent back to the bass player via a pre-fader aux send connected to the stage monitor system. Now, this setup has been used for decades by acoustic guitarists, keyboard players, and of course, vocalists, but is still somewhat new to electric guitar and bass players. Having tried it for myself, I believe that this gives the most satisfying player experience with this type of pedal. Now, if you're going to do this, it's very important that your bass player has a dedicated monitor mix. In other words, one auxiliary send that is used by them and only them. You also need to spend some time and energy working with them to set it up such that they can hear the bass loud and clear along with whatever else is needed. For example, their vocal, if they're also singing, and whatever other channels they need to hear. This adjustment process needs to be factored into sound check or rehearsal time and will differ from player to player. Keep in mind that you generally only get one shot at this, and you do not want them to have a bad experience. With a modern digital mixer, I have found the ability to remote control the console via a tablet to be invaluable because I can stand on stage next to the player and get things adjusted exactly the way they need it. It might even be possible for the player to make those adjustments on their own using their own device if you trust them. This is especially the case for players who are already using in-ear monitors via a self-mix system, for example, an Avium system, My Mix or Live Mix system, that type of thing. There's definitely a learning curve to using this pedal as an amp replacement, but my own experience as both a bass player and a sound engineer working with bass players going ampless for the first time is that it can be surprisingly easy to get used to. The sensation of playing through the entire PA system rather than just an amplifier on stage can be quite addictive. Large sound systems speak with an authority and power far greater than any bass amp, and that combined with the tones possible from this pedal has really changed my views on the need for a bass amp on stage. It's definitely a new world of possibilities, something that we as sound engineers need to learn and help others to navigate. So, what are the situations in which this ampless method might not be the best option for you? Firstly, if you're using a smaller mixer and you cannot give your bass player a dedicated monitor mix, probably best not to try this. Secondly, if your sound system is not equipped with subwoofers, probably best not to try this. Third, if your bass player relies on their amplifier's EQ and tone controls to get their particular sound, probably best not to try this. This is especially true of setups where the XLR output on the bass amp itself is used to feed the sound system. Remember that in all dealings with your musicians, communication is key. There's nothing wrong with suggesting that a player try something new, just don't suggest it 10 minutes before the opening song of the night. If you or the company you own or run or work for are fortunate enough to own one of these DIs, you might bring it along to a rehearsal and show it to the player, just to put the idea into their minds that maybe this is something they might like to try. Now, let's move on to the second question. So, all of these amp emulation pedals are different because they represent different makes and model of historical amplifier. Fortunately, the manufacturers of these units typically provide detailed documentation about what the various controls do, and Origin Effects is no exception. As a sound engineer, it behooves you to study up accordingly, just as you would when learning about a new mixer or piece of outboard gear. So let's hit some of the highlights of the Bassrig 64 black panel. Firstly, the difference between the amp out and DI out connectors. In a traditional DI box, both the through and XLR output connectors carry essentially the same signal as that plugged into the input. The only difference being that the one at the XLR output is both balanced and low impedance. Remember that one of the main goals of a traditional DI box is signal integrity, keeping the tone of your guitar or bass the same from source to console. With amp emulation DIs, that goal is modified to making your guitar or bass sound like it's plugged into the amp being emulated. On the Bassrig 64 black panel, the amp out connector is intended for connection to a traditional on-stage bass amplifier and does not include any cabinet or loudspeaker simulation. The DI out, on the other hand, includes an analog simulation of a mic'd up Fender 2x15 speaker cabinet. The cab sim is always active when the pedal is engaged and can even be set to be active when the pedal is bypassed. This setting enables the pedal to function purely as a cabinet simulator in conjunction with other drive pedals placed earlier in the player's signal chain. Secondly, how the drive, blend, and output knobs work together. As you look at the front of the pedal, you'll notice 6 big silver knobs, which are the main amplifier controls, if you will, and below them, 2 much smaller knobs, as well as 3 mini toggle switches, which I like to refer to as the administrative controls. Let's cover the big ones first. In the top row, going from left to right, first you have the drive knob. According to Origin, this functions exactly like the volume knob on a non-master volume amp. Turning it clockwise gives more gain, drive, and distortion. Turning it counterclockwise results in a cleaner sound. Next to this, you have a blend knob, which blends in the original, clean, or unaffected signal with the signal passing through the amplifier emulation circuitry. Next to that, the output knob sets the pedal's overall output level. Origin makes it clear that this knob is not part of the amp recreation circuitry and thus does not alter the tone of the pedal. It simply makes the output louder or quieter. As the sound engineer, it's important that you understand how these 3 knobs work together. With the pedal engaged and the blend set fully clockwise, turning the drive knob all the way down results in no sound, just as it would on a non-master volume amplifier. This will be the case even if the volume knob is turned up. As you turn the drive knob up, the output of the pedal gets louder and louder, which you compensate for by turning the output level down in order to keep the output level consistent. Have a listen. Now, there's nothing new about this type of interaction between the drive and output levels on a pedal. Guitarists have used it on overdrive and distortion pedals for decades. However, sound engineers who are not familiar with this system may be caught off guard. There are 2 important things to understand. First, there can be a very significant difference between the level of the bypassed signal and when the pedal is engaged. In my testing, the unity gain position, if one could term it that, is with the pedal in the black phase setting, with the bright fat switch in the middle position, and with all the knobs set to 12 o'clock. Of course, in the real world, the likelihood of the knobs actually being in this position is next to 0. If you work with a player who regularly switches the pedal on and off, it's important to work with them to manage the level difference through the use of the output knob. Otherwise, there'll be a huge jump in the level of the bass guitar and the sound system, which will ruin the balance in your mix. It's similar to working with a keyboard player who uses several different sounds or patches during a gig. These are often quite different in volume, and I will usually ask the keyboard player to turn the keyboard volume up or down by an appropriate amount to keep the levels relatively consistent. Secondly, it's important to understand that in this context, the output knob should not be used as a volume control. The idea is to work with your bass player and encourage them not to turn up the pedal output control if they cannot hear themselves, because this can very quickly clip the input on your mixing console, which will result in a very ugly non-musical form of distortion. If the pedal is being used in conjunction with a bass amp, the level on the bass amp should be increased. If using an amp-less setup, the level of the monitor send should be raised. It may also help to reduce the level of other signals being sent to that monitor. Third, variations on the specific amplifier being emulated. One of the interesting aspects of amp emulation pedals is that they sometimes offer variations on a particular amplifier. In the case of the Bassrig 64, there are actually 2 emulated output stages and 2 sets of tone controls available, and these are controlled by these mini toggle switches hiding between the 2 rows of knobs. The first of these is a 2-position switch labeled TWD for tweed and BLK for blackface. These represent the 2 different tone stacks, also known as EQ controls, that are available: a 1950s and a 1960s bassman, according to Origin Effects. Switching from the blackface to the tweed setting will add mids and gain for a more aggressive sound. Check it out. The second variation available is controlled by this 3-position mini toggle switch on the right. This has a center flat or off position, as well as bright and fat positions as shown. More than just an EQ switch, this actually controls the pedal's emulated output stage. In the bright and middle positions, the circuit is configured like a Fender Showman. In the fat position, this changes the configuration to that of a Fender Bassman. With the 2 Showman positions, low frequencies are removed as the output stage begins to distort, keeping the low end tighter and more stable. With the Bassman position, the low frequencies are retained, which can add warmth and depth at cleaner settings, but also results in a wonderful out-of-control sound as the drive increases. Have a listen. The reason it's important for us as sound engineers to be familiar with these controls is that they fundamentally change the nature and behavior of the pedal. If your guitarist suddenly swapped out their Fender Twin Reverb, say, for a Roland Jazz Chorus, you would certainly want to at least be aware of it as the band's sound engineer. In the same way, it's important to at least understand the importance of these little switches to the sound that's coming into your mix. The final aspect of this pedal that I'd like to discuss is the amp out EQ section. These controls are placed right at the end of the pedal's signal chain, after the main drive and tone controls, and they work only on the 1/4 inch amp out connector. They're designed to optimize the tone of this output for the bass amplifier it is connected to. The idea is that you set up the main tone controls to work well with the DI out sound, and then adjust the amp out EQ to make your stage amplifier sound its best, avoiding the need to compromise between the tone going to the PA system and the tone in the bass amplifier. The horn cut switch is a low-pass filter designed for use with tweeter-equipped bass amps and cabs to reduce the harshness of the overdriven tone. Unlike the main tone controls, the LF and HF controls are modern active EQ filters which can both cut and boost. According to Origin, the HF control can be used to adjust the high-end response of the Bassrig to match your clean tone, add some vintage character to a modern cab, or fine-tune the effect of the horn cut filter. Similarly, the LF control can be used to make a small cab sound fat or reduce boominess associated with a big cab. As you can see, these controls, especially the LF and HF mini knobs, have been designed to be difficult to adjust accidentally. The idea that you set them up for use with a particular amplifier and then leave them alone. As a sound engineer, these controls are very important because they allow you, in consultation with your bass player, to fine-tune the signal going to the stage amplifier and, as mentioned earlier, avoid having to compromise the amp tone for the tone in the PA system or vice versa. So that wraps up this video. I hope it's been helpful to you in learning how to deal with this particular type of DI box. I'm personally very excited about the new possibilities being opened up by Amp Emulation DIs. Not only do they make the tone and feel of vintage tube amps available once again, they are tremendous assets to sound engineers when it comes to achieving both simplicity of setup as well as consistency of sound from night to night, from venue to venue. If you like my content, please consider subscribing and supporting me on Patreon. Links to my website and social media are in the description section below, as well as in the video end cards. Until the next time, this is Bruno Luce saying thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.